Time will tell if I know as much as you have implied, but I will endeavour to share something of the subject. What is the catalyst for this is the diary of the Reverend Anthony McIntyre. Domestic missioners were required to keep a diary, which he did, and it survives. Not many of them do, and it gives us a lot of information about Belfast at that time. It's a fairly short window, 1853 to 1856, but it gives us a lot of insight into the state of affairs in the city at that time, and how McIntyre is working and what he achieves. The Domestic Mission to the Poor of Belfast, that was its title. It is founded in April 1853. It is not a congregation in the way that Presbyterians understand congregations. It was never part of a presbytery. It was never part of the formal structure. It was run by a mission committee. And the mission committee, in essence, and certainly for many years in the earlier stage, was run by members of this church and of the second congregation. They were the linchpins in the whole organisation. So this was, as Dr. Steer said, it is the non-subscribing side of the Irish Presbyterian family. This is their endeavour to do something about what was a very obvious problem. The background. Belfast population. I'm going to run some figures past you. Pay no heed to the exact detail, but you get the image of the thing. 1800, 18,500. 1811, 27,000. 1821, 37,000. 1831, 53,000. 1841, 70,000. 1851, 87,000. 1861, 121,000. 1871, 175,000. You get a picture there, I need say no more. Rapid growth. Now, the churches were responding. Now, throughout the 18th century, the churches, certainly in Presbyterian terms, were an established and limited number of congregations. This congregation, the first church, an original basis in 1642, the second in 1708, the third in 1721, the fourth, Donegal Street, 1791. Plus, two Church of Ireland, one Roman Catholic. That was the religious provision for Belfast at the end of the 18th century. In the 19th century, it begins to advance more quickly. Fisherwick, 1823. May Street, 1829. Townsend Street, 1833. York Street, 1840. The Seceders at Fitzroy Avenue in 1820. And other denominations rapidly increasing and expanding. The non-subscribers were at first happy with the first and second congregations. They thought that gave them sufficient provision they could manage. But the growth of numbers persuaded them that they really couldn't manage, and there were bits of the town and parts of the community that they were not effectively engaging with. Their next move is to create a new church in York Street in 1840. They don't actually take a site and build, they buy what had been previously the Beth Barai Methodist meeting house, and they establish that. They rebuild in 1855, and they stay there until 1941, when the Luftwaffe evicted them. But in spite of that, there was still felt to be a need, not just with seating space, that is the actual physical capacity of existing meeting houses, but with a need to reach out. Dr. Steers reminds us of Dr. Joseph Tuckerman of Boston, USA, the concept of his missionary work there, which he then promoted, which took root in England by the 1830s, especially in industrial cities like Liverpool and Manchester and London and elsewhere. The idea spread to Belfast. A letter from Mrs. A.G. Malcolm of March 1853 requested that the committee be instructed to take into their serious consideration the establishment of a ministry to the poor in this town. The whole thought proceeded very rapidly. Within 2 months, committees were appointed and subscriptions sought. On the 8th of June, it was agreed to advertise for a missioner at £120 per annum, which was a decent enough salary. Now, this was not the first such body in Belfast. The town mission had been in existence for some years, initially on a fairly broad basis, then from 1843, essentially under Presbyterian aegis. But there were other bodies and individual ministers who had an interest in this sphere of work. Some of you will know the writings of the Reverend William O'Hanlon, Walks Among the Poor of Belfast, first published in 1853. This is putting increased focus on what was a major need. So why was such a mission needed? Rapid influx of population, certainly, but why not just build churches? Well, they did, but many did not go. Never mind the churches, there were many who did not darken the door. Why? Very many came in from towns and districts around. County Antrim, County Down, all the towns and communities you could think of, people were coming in a steady flow from those places to Belfast. And moving away from home and coming into the town, they lose their old church connection and very often fail to make a new one. Also, many of them were very poor. They really don't find this city to be El Dorado or anything like it. They have an existence and sometimes not much more. Therefore, they have no money for the plate, which is a wee embarrassment on a Sunday morning. Also, they do not have respectable clothing. The concept of the time was that to go to meeting, you had to be dressed. And if you couldn't be suitably dressed, then, well, they didn't go. After a little while, the inevitable happened. They got used to staying at home. So the answer was felt to be, take the church to them in their own homes. Pastoral care for the people, plus Sunday schools, education and services of worship. And above all, to do this in such a way and in places where the poor would feel at home. The domestic mission was this kind of unusual structure. As I said, not a congregation, but run essentially by leading members of this congregation and the second congregation, and chiefly funded by businessmen and well-to-do of these congregations. On the 10th of August 1853, the first missionary was chosen, the Reverend Anthony McIntyre of Dublin. McIntyre was an interesting character. He had, in an earlier phase, been a Methodist minister and had been stationed in various places in County Antrim and County Down. He was later in Dublin, presumably in the same connection. There may then have been a change in theological outlook, and I believe he spent some time in the north of England, where he developed his knowledge of domestic missions. He comes to Belfast full of enthusiasm, as recorded in his diary. Now, the keeping of such a journal or diary was required of missionaries and was inspected at committee meetings. McIntyre's was presented and read every fortnight. Given this, we must be aware that McIntyre was writing for an audience, his employers, a committee that included 2 other ministers. He needed to prove that he was actually working, and he needed to prove that he was doing some good and that he was achieving something. So to this end, he emphasized the needs of the poor. It was not hard for him to find examples. Description of some of the locations he visits. This is a very low place. Living in great filth, no furniture in the house. One of the most wet, filthy and unwholesome back cabins in the town. This is a filthy place in every sense. That statement he went on to enlarge by saying how either there were no sewers or they failed to perform. The houses do not turn the rain. That's a fairly basic failing in a house. The whole of the roof of the house has fallen in. Bedclothes saturated. The south side, especially miserable hovels. Crawford's Entry, 4 houses not fit for pigs to shelter in. And then describing a visit in Little Donegal Street. Mary Lyons, an old skeleton, having the appearance of one lately risen from the grave, seated on a stone and surrounded by slates, pieces of old mortar, the floor flooded with water, and no fire that I could see before her. The entire top of the house had fallen in. A very unwholesome place, no back premises, by which he means no backyard and almost certainly no toilet facilities. He describes innumerable lanes, entries and courts. Now, these are not the main streets. Oh, he walked the main streets many a day, but that was not his domain. That was not where he visited. But the little places that were off them, teeming with people. As I was thinking about this, something came to my mind from, well, when I was an undergraduate at Queen's a good few years ago, somewhere in the mid-70s. And in my travels somewhere at that stage, about the top of Crummock Street, I came across an area that was about to be demolished. I mean, literally the demolition work was going on around. But it was abandoned, just waiting for the bulldozer, and my curiosity could not be conquered, and I wandered in to have a look. Riley's Entry leading to Riley's Court. Riley's Entry was maybe 50 yards long, 3 houses each side. Riley's Court, a little square with houses around each side. No great number of houses. They, I suspect, were tolerably decent houses for the time. What intrigued me was that the pavements were cobbled. Not with the flat square sets that we have known in more recent times, but with the rounded cobbles typical of the mid-Victorian period. What it reminds me of was these entries and courts were how, I don't think they called them developers, but you get the idea, filled in little scraps of ground between streets, little areas that had been open. An entry was made and a court established behind it, and so they filled all the available ground with housing. The standard varied from fair to very, very poor. He does mention some new streets being laid out, mentions one near the workhouse, that is off the Lisburn Road. If any of you don't know, the workhouse, think Belfast City Hospital. It grew out of the Belfast workhouse. But these little places were tacked on everywhere there was a little bit of ground. Add to this that there were other, probably slightly older and slightly larger buildings that were subdivided. McIntyre says, going upstairs to visit a family. A widow woman and 3 children in a room. That was their entire accommodation. Called on Mrs. Adams, found herself and daughter shut up in a little back apartment. On opening the door, the impure atmosphere that met us was most offensive. Now, by this stage, this man should have been fairly well able to cope with such things, but this one impressed him. Was most offensive. Confined and filthy as the lane is, we were glad to get out to it, leaving the door open for a time before entering, hoping by that stage that the worst of the miasma had dissipated. Jane McCafferty, who lives in an upper room, someone else living in a garret. This woman with 5 children and her husband and another woman and 2 children live in a low garret over a small house. This is a wretched house. Father, mother and 5 children all sleep in the same bed. 7 other persons sleep in the same room. Over and over again, he indicates that there is no furniture. A woman sitting on a stone, sewing. Many could not afford furniture, others had pawned it. Pawnbrokers did a steady trade. Many houses had the barest of furniture, if any. The son sleeps on the bare boards, no covering except his day clothes. He simply lay down in what he was wearing. Over and again there are references to items including clothes being in pawn. When all else failed, these people would take the clothes off their back and pawn them, perhaps for the sake of 3 halfpence. It is therefore to be expected that these people had few clothes. The word rags is often used. Child's shirt in pawn. Jane Mitchell, almost naked. Cannot go out for want of clothes. Cannot go to school for want of clothes. No clothes on children except old rags. Mother not able to get clothes for children. Where this problem is seen, especially from McIntyre's point of view, is in regard to church services. Victorian respectability meant that going to church required decent clothes. As they would have said in a country parish, your Sunday go-to-meeting suit or coat or whatever. These people are not in that league at all. But the society considered that it was a point of respect to the Lord to dress as best you could, and those who couldn't, well. Therefore, no clothes, no church. McIntyre is often told this as he speaks to people. At one point, he is given 6 petticoats to be distributed, which he assures are greatly received. Yet this was a problem the domestic mission was designed to cope with. As long as they had something to wear, these people were among friends and neighbours, others like them. Given the poor housing and lack of clothes, you could hardly expect food to be either nutritious nor ample. They said they had to fast many a day. They scarcely get food to support them. In some house, 3 or 4 little children eagerly devouring a raw cabbage. I found the mother dividing a raw turnip among the little ones. A whole family, 7 strong, had no other food than a farthing turnip. Not one of 4 children has tasted food for more than 30 hours. They are in a state of absolute starvation. Good advice will not meet the case. It was his custom to talk to them, to read, pray, and to give them advice. He is so appalled by what he meets that no, advice will not do. Hunger, in a greater or lesser degree, is often reported. Put these elements together, and illness is only to be expected. The catch-all description of fever is often used. Severe cases are taken to the fever hospital. That was one of the departments of the workhouse infirmary. So they're at the workhouse in the Lisburn Road. But he also describes how there are recurrent, shall we say, epidemics, some greater, some lesser. For example, very general sickness among the children. Several teachers and many scholars unwell. And then in 1854, there are numerous references to cholera. A man buried 5 of his family inside 3 weeks of cholera. 3 cases of cholera in Linus Lane, all dead. Cholera very bad, Mustard Street, 10 deaths. But there were many other afflictions. General weakness and debility of all kinds were common. The father sitting very unwell, body and limbs greatly swollen. So afflicted with rheumatism was she that he can make no use of the limbs. Another case, a doctor was sent for, but not having 10 shillings to pay him, he refused to come. So, in the absence of medical remedies, people turned to spiritual support. McIntyre was often sent for to attend the sick, He would read scripture, he would offer prayer, and endeavour to bring comfort, especially to those nearing death. He spends a great deal of time in this work and is often sent for. It must have been a burden upon him, especially in the cases of children, many of whom are obviously failing. He describes baptizing 2 children, and that a week later both are dead. There is high infant mortality. Now, one thing worth remembering is that the people and situations that McIntyre is describing are the very poorest, the bottom of the pile. These are not the people, the labouring people who are getting by tolerably well. These are the people who are struggling to get by at all. It's almost a subclass, and sometimes almost out of sight. And so often these people were recently in better conditions. He refers to men out of work, whether a downturn in industry or perhaps even harsh winter weather, because many workers, many labourers were laid off in times of bad weather. These are very much the economically vulnerable. Or he refers to those who are sick, that is, unable to go to their work, unable to earn wages. These people will have little or nothing in reserve. Or there are many references to widows with small children. Given high mortality, this was often the case. Many women are left far earlier than might have been hoped with children and the husband deceased. For them, the double tasks of earning a living and raising children was a great challenge. Often these women earned money by sewing, or what they described as veining or edging, which are all departments of the same trade, plying the needle. And often with the help of their children. Children at 7 or 8 years old were applying the needle to assist their mother. He describes an elderly couple making an existence by making mats, door mats, mats for floor covering. They wove these and sold them. Or another woman who broke stones. She got the stones somewhere about Forth River, brought them back to where she lived, broke them and then sold them on. All that travelling done in her bare feet. Most of these people, it doesn't say. I suspect McIntyre just thought it was so absolutely standard that he didn't even bother to mention it. Bare feet was standard. Then there's a little curiosity, because remember the dates when he's writing, 1854, 5, 6. There's one lady begging for help because her husband has enlisted. He is in the barracks, and after his necessary costs are met, there's very little money left for wife and family. Another lady is hoping to join her husband in the army. You're maybe there ahead of me. In the Crimea. These are the years of the Crimea War. Maybe better for the husband, but definitely not for the family. The children of these families aspired to be in service. So many people were in service in those years, and some of them very young. Domestic service, helping others in their houses. Or to be errand boys. And if things went really well for them, to be apprentices. Others were glad to get into one of the mills, and there were many mills in Belfast at this time. But none of these were well-paid occupations. But there were few alternatives. At the very bottom of the pile was begging. Now, McIntyre was appalled by children being sent out to beg, even beaten for not going. One example, he found that the child was terrified, would not go, not because she objected to begging, but she was scared that the police were going to catch her this time. He felt that this would destroy all semblance of character. Often he is approached about getting situations for people, that is, employment, and is pleased when on one occasion his reference tips the scale and gets a man into a place in Mr. Rowan's foundry in York Street, which in those days was a major and well-known enterprise. But what were the options if none of these things came together? The workhouse. By this stage, by McIntyre's time, the workhouse has been functioning 12, 13 years. As I said, Lisburn Road, City Hospital site. He recommends some to go there, but there is resistance, especially where there are children. A woman who had a grandchild, no, they would be parted at the workhouse. She says she would rather die with me than leave me. Or why at the workhouse they would take her little girl from her. The only child is greatly petted on herself and would cry itself to death in a short time. Or an older couple. The old man is dying, and we like to be together and to get dying in peace. McIntyre makes a special journey to the workhouse to see for himself. Staff show him through the complex. The buildings are clean, the food middling. At this stage, what was later known in the workhouse as outdoor relief was rare. It's beginning, but it is rare. That is, making provision either for money or for tickets which will provide food and so on for others still in their own homes. McIntyre gives relief. He's given money for the purpose, chiefly from well-to-do supporters of the mission. And he often describes reaching into his purse and giving sixpence. In our terms, probably between £5 and £10. Sometimes it's less, twopence or fourpence, and on one occasion all he has left, a penny halfpenny. Or he will buy food. He will take a child to a grocery shop he knows and buy sixpence worth of groceries. Or sometimes meal, probably oatmeal. In other words, they can make porridge with that. But there are limits on what he can do. Funds are limited and the calls upon them endless. This he finds a challenge to his work as a minister, because he knows that many people are sending for him simply in the hope of getting money or material help. Often McIntyre refers to others. There are quite a number of organisations referred to. He says, some clothing society with which Miss Stevenson and Miss Knox are connected. Now, whether they were members of the church circle that were known or even of the ladies' committee, he quotes the names, believing that the committee will recognise the names. He refers to ladies of the visiting committee and the Dorcas committee. The Dorcas, of course, being the clothing side. That was their speciality. But there were ladies who did visit, sometimes with them, sometimes on their own. There were those who made this their special effort. Blankets are in great demand, because these people have nothing to cover them when they go to bed at night, literally. Also, there is a need for heating. Belfast in the winter then was no warmer than it is now. He says, Miss Stevenson, 8 Lindenhall Street, gave me a book of receipts for coal. And he could give these to families, and that would entitle them to half a hundredweight of coal. Now, there's some confusion amongst different groups. Some are connected fairly clearly with the Mission Society, and there is a ladies' committee and some very notable figures. One who is mentioned is a Miss Jane Bruce, daughter of the Reverend William Bruce, whose memorial is there. Miss Jane Bruce was involved at the very beginning of the mission in 1853. She was still involved right up to her death in 1933 at age 101. She was one of those delightful people, apparently, whose mind was crystal clear right the way through. But she took and maintained that interest. Or reference to Mrs. and Miss Dunville, Dunville's distillery, again the church connection, and they're active. Ladies Visiting Committee, I'm not certain whether it is part of the Mission Society or overlap with another body. But another one that he refers to often, the ladies of the Destitute Sick Society. They will make grants, but they do so from, shall we say, another church perspective, and would quiz applicants disapprovingly if they were hearers of McIntyre. He still uses them because he needs that help. Nevertheless, such groups were the mainstays of his support of dire poverty. As I say, some ladies went with him in visiting and thereafter took some families under their wing. It was clearly felt by upper middle class ladies that this was something they should interest themselves in. All of this helps, but it is short-term assistance. What are the longer-term aims? Well, again, it's quite plain. Social and moral improvement, that's the ambition. At the very start, McIntyre records, multitudes of children attend no school. As long as the children are allowed to run the street and to grow up in habits of idleness and vice, the improvement of society is out of the question. Now there is standard, solid Victorian morality. In this, he had the full support of the Mission Committee. The Victorians believed passionately in education, and they saw it as a means not merely of providing useful information, but of shaping and designing your whole life and life experience for all the years to follow. As early as September 1853, he's only there at 6 weeks, they are looking for a site for a school. He visits other schools, Lower Kent Street, Birch Street, Linus Court, there were many, and speaks approvingly of the infant, industrial and ragged schools in Frederick Street, and tries to get children admitted there. In addition to the practical details, there were ongoing problems. Most schools charged a penny a day. That is, the child was expected to come with a penny in their hand. Not all could pay. Also, many children had not clothing even sufficient to go to school. Also, many children would come and go. They would come for a time, or then they would go to another school, or they would stop going to school for a time. It was a fluid situation, and of course, at that stage, education was not compulsory. There was no legal requirement. If you went, it was only because the family saw it as a desirable thing. On the 6th of February 1854, he reports proudly, "We opened our mission school today, 16 present." Numbers grew steadily and rapidly. It was situated at the corner of William Street and John Street, which is basically where the Central Library is today. There are elements of William Street still surviving. The William Street School. A master was appointed, classes began. Within a fairly short time, numbers increase and are hold steady. There is a master, a mistress, and 6 monitors. The numbers go even over 100, but they did tend to fluctuate. The weather, the season, movement between schools, and the whole issue of free places. Then there follows inspection and negotiation with the commissioners of national education to have the school taken on as a national school. That would provide salaries for the teachers and grants toward necessities. It was finally successful, and the William Street School joined the many national schools. This was a common pattern for the time. Schools opened by private bodies, individuals, and very often churches or church-based groups, and then becoming national schools. McIntyre puts a lot of work into this. He is in school virtually every day and actually will spend time, half an hour or an hour, teaching a particular group. The school runs 5 days a week plus Saturday mornings. There are evening classes for young adults who have, shall we say, missed out previously on education. There is a shoemaker employed to teach the boys that trade. The whole thing seems to be prospering. There's a curious little aside when he says that some of the work might have to be delayed or stopped for a time until we get the gas installed. Candles are costing far too much. The gas is extending very slowly. And he proudly quotes a star pupil, or refers to. This little boy, John Stewart is his name, knew very little when he came to our school and could not possibly have got education had it not been for it. I found him in rags, in want, sitting idle and without any means of redeeming himself. I brought him to the school. In accounts, he could not do simple addition. He is well acquainted with arithmetic now. He has a good knowledge of fractions, practice, interest, etc., and possesses a fair knowledge of the principles of grammar, geography, and a variety of other subjects. I have helped him a little all through. Often he has been in want, and as often when I have known it, I have relieved him. Now it is to be hoped that he will require no more aid from us. I must say that he was one of the most attentive, obedient, industrious, good little boys I ever knew, and I did not allow the opportunity of his leaving the school to pass unnoticed. He is proclaimed as a glowing example of what the rest of them should aspire to. Closely allied with the school is that other stalwart of Victorian church and society, the Sunday school. There was an element of general education involved in the Sunday schools at that time, but more strongly faith-based, and being able to read the Bible was considered an accomplishment by children and their families. McIntyre believes that this is the key to developing a church family, in effect, what would become a congregation. He spends a lot of time knocking doors, following up on children absent from day school or Sunday school. Illness was often the reason, or as he finds they have changed school for some reason or another. But it seemed to have been an understood thing that if a child attended a day school connected with the church, they should also attend the Sunday school in connection with that church. Pressure was often brought to bear. There were also the classic highlights of the Sunday school year: the picnic or excursion. One year they go to Queen's Island. Now, the Queen's Island had only just developed from Dargan's Island at that stage. It was only now becoming a place of resort. The mud, or glaur, dredged out of the Victoria Channel and piled up, had now established itself into a place which was understood as a place of recreation for many people in Belfast. And he records having a happy day there with a large number of children. The days of Harland and Wolff were still that little bit in the future. Another occasion, they go to the grounds of the home of the Dunville family I mentioned before, that is the distillery people. What it meant was it was a day out of the wee streets, a day out of the lanes and courts and entries and all of that, a day somewhere where there was fresh air and grass and all of that. These were very successful events. What about McIntyre, the missionary to the poor of Belfast? He begins by entering poor districts and simply knocking doors. He talks to people. He inquires about who they are and where they come from and how they're provided for, and about church connections. One day, 5 families in Little May Street, 2 Methodist, 2 Presbyterian, 1 ought to be Church of Ireland. It was his custom that he would offer prayer, and he leaves tracts. Now, some of these were theological, others were just of a morally improving character. The Victorians had masses of these things which they eagerly distributed. He leaves tracts. Sometimes he only loans them the tract. He does not have sufficient. The resources are limited, and, he'll pick it up the next time he's back. But he is well received. These people are glad to have a minister call at their house. Now, many had church connections in Antrim, Newtonards, Lisburn, Ballymena, etc., all the towns round you could imagine. But this had lapsed when they came into Belfast. The town churches were growing rapidly. But the minister there was fully occupied attending to those who came to their church. Therefore, they didn't have the time to chase after the others, to go looking for other people who had no obvious intention of darkening a church door. Besides, those were generally too poor. Money and clothing, still the issues. And they'd got out of the way of church going. Something we know at present, but for very different reasons. But it is a custom and a habit. We all know that as church people, that is what makes such a difference. These people, in the entries, the courts, the back streets, were the domain of the domestic missionary. When McIntyre becomes known, he is often asked to call upon people who are ill. Sometimes they seek advice, sometimes financial or medical support. But more often, they simply seek a word of prayer. One lady says to him, "It was the Lord who sent you here." He would often return to see the sick, especially those who were poorly or who he judged to be dying. At first, he often takes Sunday services in churches of the denomination: Hollywood, Newtonards, Dunmurray, Cumber, York Street. Second congregation, behind us here. Not here. He doesn't record taking a service here. I suspect the reason was that this congregation was then a collegiate charge. Both Mr. Bruce and John Scott Porter were involved actively serving the ministry here, so if one couldn't preach, the other one did. McIntyre doesn't appear to be here. But of course he did know this building. This was somewhere he would have been, and probably the mission committee would have met on premises here. Certainly he knew the place and the people. But as the work in the mission increases, he stops preaching around. Sunday, the 12th of February 1854, held our first meeting for public worship in the mission house this evening at 7 p.m, including children 80 to 90 present. His services are 7 p.m, 6 p.m, even 5 p.m. It does seem to vary. The curious, well, it's not really curious thing is evening services. These people often spent their entire week so busily occupied that come the weekend, when I say the entire week, that included Saturday. Saturday was a working day for these people, and right through to like 6 at night. So come Sunday, they were weary. These people really weren't up to going to church on a Sunday morning, even if they'd been inclined. Therefore, the mission services were on a Sunday evening. That was a custom that continued all down the years. A congregation, Dr. Steers knows well, our church in York Street, which did cater for a poor or section of the community, its main services were always in the evening. Oh, the morning service was there, but the numbers came in the evening. They simply rested on a Sunday morning. That was an established practice and long continued. He tries to encourage attendance at the mission services, even going out on a Saturday to remind them that tomorrow's Sunday and I'm looking for you. Wonder would that do any good? Anyway, great numbers of people, he says, I still cannot induce to attend any place of worship. He says there's lack of Sabbath observance. He realizes in many ways it's an uphill challenge. Also, his circle of people is always much wider than those who would come to the services, those who are seeking some benefit or some support from him, not necessarily seeking to worship with him. He also has a challenge of people moving house. It's quite common. Often, he says, went to see such and such a family, couldn't find them, nobody knew where they'd gone. Often no forwarding address. Could have been that they had done, what's the phrase, a moonlight flit? Or it could have been that they were simply seeking better accommodation somewhere else. But the ones that he does get at home, and he gets very many, he describes making 20 or nearer 30 visits in a single day. And that pattern is repeated. Now, it can't have been very long. I'm used with a country ministry where you go into a house in the evening, and that's your evening. You come out at bedtime. But I know that in Belfast it would be a little different. It certainly was with McIntyre. He must have been in some houses 15 or 20 minutes and then on again. But he read a portion of Scripture. He left tracts with some, conversed and had prayer with others. He describes debates with Roman Catholics. Some would not take his tracts. A few would not even speak to him. He also discovers in Sandy Row, very strong party feeling exists there. My goodness, imagine that, in Belfast. This mid-1850s, 1857, there's the first of the significant riots in the town, and then a further and more serious episode in 1864. He refers, as you might well imagine, to the evils of drink. And he contrasts houses and families where drink was or was not an issue. I fancy he labours that point often, tries to persuade people to abstain, not always successfully. Now, I've no doubt that he labours those points for the benefit of the committee, but it does affect him. In some cases, well, it's very difficult indeed. He describes one street where he declines, he fails, he refuses to go into any one of the houses, but stands in the street and speaks to those who will speak to him. The reputation of the place was exceedingly low. In one case he records, "Conduct too bad for recording in this diary." The mind boggles. But then, what can we say? All ministers ever meet a wide range of people, saints and sinners. There is denominational rivalry, some of it on a theological basis. There are other missionaries who encouraged McIntyre's congregation to leave his ministry, saying that if they stayed with him, they were at the risk of their souls. He mentioned several times a town missionary called Graham, who advised people against him. Or there are other instances recorded of a scripture reader coming to a house of McIntyre's congregation and gathering people together there on a Sunday evening at the time of McIntyre's service. Or Sunday school teachers from other congregations who called for children early on a Sunday morning and insisted that they go with them to their Sunday school and not McIntyre's. This is not not merely Presbyterian activity. The Church of Ireland are doing exactly the same. There's a lot of toing and froing and tugging amongst the church groups at the time. Though it does seem slightly strange that when there were so many people who were unchurched, there was so much contention over the ones who were. It should also be noticed that McIntyre was not so radical in theology as this might imply. While probably not strictly orthodox on the Trinity, most of his profession was normative Christianity. He writes, I read Scripture and spoke to him on the nature of salvation and the importance of being always ready for death. There are many such references. He does build a congregation that is handed on through the hands of other missionaries and several changes of location. It is still technically in existence, although mission activity in the old style really ended about 50 years ago. McIntyre himself left the post at the end of March 1857. Somehow, he had got on the wrong side of the Ladies' Committee of the Mission Society, to the point where they advise that if he does not leave, they will resign en masse. He is advised by the main committee, having lost the confidence of the Committee of the Domestic Mission, he should resign, which he does. As was typical of those days, there is no clear indication as to quite what he'd done or not done or whatever. That is it. He is paid off at the end of March and disappears. I would love to know what became of the fellow, where he went, had he a further career in church work, but at this stage certainly I know nothing more about him. But I do not wish to end on that note. On Friday the 14th of March 1856, a woman called at his house. I have called, sir, to thank you for the great benefit I have received under your ministry. The way you have explained the Scriptures and the light and comfort I have got have given to me the greatest happiness of my life. I was a stranger in Belfast, and I was a stranger to the peace of the gospel, and I could not describe to you how unhappy I felt. But now I feel happy in respect of my salvation and in praying to my Heavenly Father. As I am going to live with relations in Glasgow, I thought it my duty to come and acknowledge the benefit I am under to your reverence. For those of us who are ministers, isn't it the case that we hope and pray that somewhere along the way and by the grace of God, we have been a blessing to someone we have met or known? Thank you very much.